Now we will discuss the US Congress gives Ukraine sizable, if not timely, aid. And finally, after lots of delay, the US House of Representatives that controls the purse, it is the lower house of the US Congress. The US Congress has the Senate, the upper house, and then the House of Representatives, the lower house. The House of Representatives votes on the budget and controls purse strings. And for a long time, the Republicans in the House of Representatives did not want to give any money to Ukraine, or not the same amount of money, or wanted to tie the Ukrainian vote to their other issues, such as border control. Finally, Speaker Mike Johnson has shepherded a bill with Democratic support that gives Ukraine significant aid, sizable aid. And is it just a bit too late, Glenn? What is the significance of what are the consequences of this aid?
Yeah, too late in relation to what, I guess, would be how we should look at it. It is not too late to save Ukraine from literal destruction. It is too late to have saved Ukraine from thousands of otherwise avoidable deaths and the loss of some territory, and the increased likelihood of ultimately a stalemate, which would have been less likely had the aid been voted 5 months ago. I wish I hadn't gotten it right 6 months ago when I wrote that the most important battlefield in Ukraine was in the minds of 12 far-right, Trump-supporting, Russian-influenced members of the United States Congress. And it is they who held up the aid, they and Donald Trump, who held up the aid package being voted, which is overwhelmingly supported by a majority of Americans and members of Congress, Senate and House. Although still shockingly, it should be shocking, and it is not, 112 Republicans opposed the aid, thereby actually voting in favor, in a negative sense, of Russia's triumph in Ukraine and the destruction of NATO, which is truly alarming. But what has the aid done? It has certainly now avoided the probable collapse of Ukraine, not just the compromise of territory for sovereignty, but what would have been the collapse without American material aid. Ukraine could not survive. This is not to ignore or diminish the significance of European aid, which is equal to that of the United States. But without both, Ukraine cannot forget parry, I used that word before, cannot survive Russia's attacks. The aid also has now avoided what would have been a near existential blow to NATO as an organization, and then to the U.S.-Europe strategic relations. Europe would have been left on its own. Ukraine would have been destroyed. Another consequence would have been the confirmation of a Russian imperium in Central Europe. The Baltics, and I hardly ever have I been someone who thinks that has subscribed to the domino theory that if one falls, all of the others will fall, and so nothing can ever be conceded. I don't feel that at all. But I do think that if Russia were successful in Ukraine, that Moldova, Georgia, and the Baltics would be deeply in danger. And Poland, as its leaders have said, would have to think about what it should do. And what it would probably try to do is develop a nuclear weapon, which I don't think would be helpful for global stability. And I think also, had the aid package not been passed, it would have comforted, confirmed, and strengthened what people tend to dismissively view, I think, as the Russia, China, Iran alliance, which they view, understandably, as a defensive one against the U.S. imperium. So what will now happen? Well, I think disaster has been averted, but we'll probably have stasis. Russia, for this year, Russia we anticipate, will launch a major series of offensives in June or before, but probably now they will be stopped. So we'll have vast more suffering in a World War One setting, really, of trench warfare. The modern technology has, if anything, made offensives more difficult than ever because nothing can be hidden on the battlefield. Nothing. Um, does that then mean perhaps an ascending likelihood or possibility of negotiations occurring in 2025? Uh, I don't know, but at least that is a possible future, which would not have been the case absent the aid. And I think we shouldn't ignore now that Putin is very good, and his assistants are very good at projecting the image that he wishes to project of authority, strength, stability, and control. And I think those things are true, but they're true until they aren't when you are dealing with a dictator. And we do know, it's not just an assessment of human nature, but we do know that the Russian population is not very happy with the war and seeing their sons go off to be turned into mist on a battlefield when I think most people recognize it's a war of aggression. Most Russians do recognize it's a war of aggression. I find the polling that indicates support to be spurious because what is one going to say in a totalitarian state? So the implications then finally are, to me, the consequence. Nearly in extremis, the U.S. has reasserted or reaffirmed or given a lifeline to the U.S. relations with Europe, the normative system, and to the centrality of the U.S. in international relations. And then finally, there are implications for Asia too. I think China is very astute and is watching the struggles that Russia has had in invading a country which doesn't have an ocean separating it from its own territory, and that the sustained U.S. aid will continue to give pause to China in its own efforts to bring Taiwan back into the one China system. And Europe remains a player in global affairs because it doesn't have to existentially scramble without the means possible at present to defend itself. And this is a nascent, a recent response by Europe, meaning NATO and the EU, in response to Russia's invasion, but it takes a decade for defense capabilities under the best of circumstances to develop. So it's a consequential decision, finally, to overcome the recalcitrant hostility of 12 Trump-supporting Republicans.
Glenn, whilst all of what you say may be true, there's a fly in the ointment. The Russian economy is actually doing fairly well. One of Russian business people and one of German economists in our circle mentioned that, look, Russia's big challenge was capital flight. Russia sold commodities, oil and gas in particular, but also other stuff like nickel and copper and other metals and commodities. And the money that came into Russia immediately flowed out to yachts in Monaco and football clubs like Chelsea, even Arsenal. And that capital flight has stopped thanks to sanctions, the unintended consequences of sanctions. So you are seeing that capital circulating within Russia, leading to a multiplier effect. Number two, what has happened in Russia is that they've had to reindustrialize. After 1991, and both of us covered shock therapy and the disaster of shock therapy, Russia deindustrialized. Now Russia has had to reindustrialize. Well, it is not making Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas like Western economies, but it is making missiles and drones and other stuff. Number three, Russia got a lot of Western assets on the cheap. Yes, it lost reserves frozen in foreign accounts, but it also got a lot of Western assets, or Russian companies did. And as a consequence of all this, real wages have increased for Russian workers for the first time since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So if you're not a mother who's lost her son, if you're not a widow who's lost her husband, if you're not a child who's lost her or his father, then war is turning out to be good. You can see war is good. And from the Russian perspective, which is very paranoid, the expansion of NATO is an existential threat. They genuinely think that if Ukraine was to join NATO, then Russia would face the next version of the Mongol invasion. And there is no getting over that fact. So I'm not so convinced that Russia's ability to fight on is weakened, especially because Ukrainian economy, as we covered in the past, has imploded, has cratered. It fell by 35%. Maybe the figure is a bit less, maybe the figure is a bit more, but that is one estimate. And Ukraine is being propped up by life support, whether it is military aid or economic aid, and at some point, the money will not be forthcoming. We can already see how in Europe, many pro-Putin candidates are rising. A couple of countries, they have won. And I'm not so optimistic about Russia dialing down. At some point, Russia and Ukraine, along with the others, will have to make a deal, or it'll be a frozen conflict. Russia is unlikely to take vast swathes of Western Europe now. Equally, Ukraine is unlikely to win the territory that Russia controls. So we are very much seeing a frozen conflict.
I fear you're right. And one more fact before we turn to something more enjoyable. The Russian war efforts compared to the U.S. war effort in the Korean War, the Russian effort is, the last I looked, smaller as a demand on the Russian economy than the U.S. devoted to the Korean War. And you're right, war is good for the economy. The cost of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers, but otherwise it can bring boom times, actually, at this level of involvement.
Yeah. Also, lest we forget, for all the New Deal, what ultimately pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression was the war economy of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, that's true.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.